I always knew I wasn't my favorite child. It wasn't something that happened overnight. It was in the little things, the way my parents doted on my sister, Emma, while barely acknowledging my achievements. The way they excused her every mistake, bailed her out of every mess, and acted like her failures were just bad luck while mine were personal flaws. By the time I was old enough to understand, it had already shaped me. I learned early that if I wanted something, I had to work for it myself. No handouts, no safety nets, no daddy will fix it. So I did. I worked my ass off, got scholarships, juggled part-time jobs, and clawed my way through college. I landed a solid career, bought my own place, and built a life that was entirely mine. My parents weren't impressed. They never had time to attend my graduation, never cared to ask about my job, never celebrated my milestones. Meanwhile, Emma made one reckless decision after another, and they treated her like a delicate princess in need of protection. Married young? Divorced 2 years later? Her husband was a cheater, poor thing. Married again, had kids, and lost everything when her second husband gambled their home away? It wasn't her fault. Married a third time, now with 6 kids, struggling financially? She just needs a little help. Help, of course, meant their money. And when their money ran out, they started looking at me. It began subtly at first. My parents started calling more often, asking how I was, inviting me over for dinner. For the first time in my life, they seemed interested in me. I wanted to believe that they were finally proud, finally seeing me for the hardworking, independent person I'd become. I let myself hope. That was my first mistake. One night, over dinner, they dropped the bombshell. They needed my help. Not for themselves, of course. For Emma. They had already done everything they could, they said. But Emma was drowning. Her 6 kids needed a bigger house, college funds, monthly support, and maybe even seed money to start a business. You're doing so well, they told me. You don't have kids, you don't have a family relying on you. It's only fair that you step up. And then, the kicker. They wanted me to buy her a 5-bedroom house, set up college funds for all 6 kids, and give her a monthly stipend of $5,000. Just a couple $1 million up front, followed by consistent financial support for the rest of her life. I sat there in stunned silence. It wasn't a request. It was a demand. They weren't proud of me. They just saw me as Emma's personal ATM. I told them no. And just like that, their love so newly discovered snapped back into its usual indifference. But this time, with something sharper. Anger, disappointment, rage. My mother cried. My father called me selfish. Emma, upon hearing the news, sent me a flood of texts ranging from guilt-tripping "how can you abandon your own family," to full-on emotional blackmail. "My kids will suffer because of you." Even her kids, those innocent little pawns, sent me messages saying, "Uncle, why don't you love us anymore?" I blocked them all. Then the real fun began. Within days, my grandparents called me, furious. My parents had been telling everyone that I was going to take care of Emma. They had already promised the family that she'd be getting a new house and financial security, and now they were humiliated because I had gone back on my word. But when I told my grandparents the truth, everything exploded. They had no idea how bad it was. They had given my parents over $200,000 years ago, expecting it to be split evenly between me and Emma for college and our future. I never saw a cent. It had all gone to Emma. My grandparents were livid. They didn't just threaten to cut my parents out of their will, they actually did it. My parents were about to lose everything, and suddenly, I wasn't just the bad guy in the family. I was their enemy, and they were about to go to war with me. I wish I could say that after I refused my parents' demands, life returned to normal, that they saw reason, that Emma finally took responsibility for her own choices, that the weight of expectation lifted from my shoulders. But no, things only got worse. Much worse. The night after our disastrous dinner, I barely slept. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing with messages from Emma. First, they were guilt trips: "I can't believe you would abandon your own nieces and nephews like this." Then came the passive-aggressive jabs: "I always knew you were selfish. But this is a new low." And finally, outright rage: "You will regret this. Just wait." I blocked her number. I knew it wouldn't stop her, but I needed a moment of peace. Then came my parents. My mother left a long, tear-filled voicemail about how I was breaking the family apart. My father, ever the enforcer, was colder. "You're a disgrace. We raised you better than this." Raised me better than this? Raised me to do what? Fund my sister's life choices while they watched from the sidelines? No, I was done. Within a few days, word spread like wildfire. It turned out my parents had already promised the extended family that I would take care of Emma. They had built up this grand story about their successful son stepping up for his struggling sister, and now they were embarrassed. The messages started coming in from aunts, uncles, cousins. Some were supportive. "We had no idea they were treating you this way." Others were less understanding. "Family takes care of each other. Why are you being so cruel?" And then there was my grandmother. She called me late one evening, her voice softer than usual. "I heard what happened," she said. "I need to see you." I drove to her house, feeling like a kid being summoned after getting caught in a lie. But when I arrived, she hugged me tight and whispered, "I'm proud of you." She sat me down and told me the truth, something I never saw coming. My grandparents had been giving my parents money for years, money meant to help both Emma and me. But while I was scraping by on scholarships and part-time jobs, Emma had been living off their generosity. "We thought we were helping both of you," she said, shaking her head. "We didn't realize your parents were only giving it to her." And then she dropped the bombshell. "We're changing the will." My grandparents decided to remove my parents from their will. Instead, they would set up trust funds for all the grandchildren, including Emma's kids, but under strict control. No more unchecked handouts. No more enabling. When my parents found out, they lost it. "This is your fault," my mother screamed over the phone. "You turned them against us." My father was quieter, but his words cut deeper. "You think you won, but you just made enemies out of your own blood." I didn't respond. What was there to say? They had spent years favoring Emma, using me only when it suited them. Now, for the first time, they were facing consequences. And they weren't handling it well. I thought Emma would back off after my grandparents' decision. Maybe she'd finally understand that the well had run dry. But no, she doubled down. First, she tried sweet-talking me. She sent a long email, pretending to be the loving sister who had no idea about our parents' favoritism. "I always thought we were close," she wrote. "I never knew they treated you so unfairly." But buried in the message was another plea for money. "I don't expect you to buy us a house, but maybe just help us out a little? My kids are struggling, and I don't know what to do." I didn't respond. The next day, she tried a different tactic. She posted a long, dramatic story on Facebook about how some people turn their backs on family when they become successful. She painted herself as a struggling mother of 6, abandoned by a selfish sibling who had forgotten where he came from. The comments were exactly what she wanted. "Wow, who would do that to their own sister? You're so strong, Emma. Your kids are lucky to have you. Family should stick together. Hope your brother realizes that before it's too late." I wanted to ignore it, but then she sent me a screenshot of her own post with a single message. "See what you've done?" I lost it. For the first time, I fired back. "No, Emma. See what you've done. You've manipulated everyone into thinking I'm the villain, when all I did was refuse to be your personal bank. You want a better life? Get a job. Stop expecting everyone else to fix your mistakes." She didn't reply, but the damage was done. The family was now fully divided, and there was no going back. I thought I had seen it all. The emotional blackmail, the lies, the manipulation. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. Late one night, I got a call from an unknown number. I hesitated before answering. "Hello?" A deep voice responded. "Hey, man. We need to talk." It was Emma's first ex-husband. We weren't close. We had barely spoken in years. But what he said next changed everything. "I heard what's going on with Emma. And there's something you need to know." I sat up straight, my heart pounding. "What is it?" There was a pause before he spoke again. "Your parents paid me to marry her." Silence. "What?" "When she got pregnant the first time, they didn't want the shame of an unwed daughter. They promised me financial support if I went through with the marriage. I thought I could make it work, but well, you know how that ended." I could barely breathe. "You're telling me they bought your marriage?" He exhaled. "Not just mine. They did the same with her second husband too." I felt sick. This wasn't just favoritism. This was control. My parents had been orchestrating Emma's life behind the scenes, throwing money at her problems and expecting everyone else to do the same. I hung up without another word. And that's when I realized this wasn't just about money. This was about power. My parents weren't just enablers. They were manipulators. And if they had gone this far for Emma, what else were they capable of? For the first time in my life, I was truly afraid of my own family, and I knew I had to get as far away from them as possible. The fallout from my grandparents' decision to disinherit my parents was like setting off a bomb in the family. The carefully maintained illusion that my parents were just loving caretakers, guiding their children to success, had been shattered. Now, they were exposed. And they knew it. It started with silence. No messages, no calls, nothing. For the first time in my life, my parents didn't seem to want to talk to me. It was eerie, like the calm before a storm. Then, one evening, my phone buzzed. A new email. From my mother. I hesitated before opening it. I already knew it wouldn't be an apology. Instead, it was a long, rambling justification. She talked about how she and my father had sacrificed everything for me, how they had put a roof over my head and food on the table, as if that wasn't the bare minimum of parenting. Then, of course, she pivoted to Emma, how Emma had always needed more support, how she was the one who would keep the family together, while I was always distant, always too focused on myself. And then came the real kicker. She accused me of ruining Emma's life. According to my mother, my refusal to bankroll Emma had triggered a financial crisis. Her husband's business had failed again. Their landlord was threatening to evict them, and the children were suffering. And it was all my fault. She demanded that I make things right, that I send Emma enough money to secure a new home, and help her get back on her feet. No mention of all the money my parents had already funneled to her. No acknowledgement of the thousands they had taken from my grandparents. Just another demand, dressed up as family duty. I closed the email, took a deep breath, and deleted it. That was the moment I realized there was no fixing this. No reasoning with them. They didn't see me as a person. They saw me as a resource. An ATM that had suddenly stopped dispensing cash. And that made me dangerous. The next day, the attack started. It began with my parents reaching out to extended family members, painting me as the ungrateful son who had abandoned his struggling sister and betrayed his parents. Some of my aunts and uncles, the ones who had always viewed my parents as the head of the family, bought into it. I started getting texts from cousins, some passive-aggressive, some outright hostile. How can you do this to your own mother? Emma's kids are innocent. You're punishing them for something that isn't their fault. Family takes care of each other. You've forgotten that. I ignored them. But then the messages turned into something worse. Emma sent me a voice note, her voice shaking with fury. You think you're better than me? Just because you got lucky? You think your stupid job makes you superior? Let's see how well you do when no one in this family speaks to you ever again. Let's see how happy your precious money makes you when you're all alone. She was right about one thing. I was alone. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid of it. Then came the final blow. My parents, furious that I had cut them off, decided to retaliate in the most destructive way possible. They reached out to my workplace. I got a call from HR, asking me to come in for an urgent meeting. When I arrived, my manager was sitting there, frowning at his laptop. He turned the screen towards me. An anonymous email had been sent to the company, accusing me of financial fraud. It was absurd, filled with outlandish claims that I had stolen money from my ailing parents, and that I had been using company resources for personal gain. There was no evidence because it was all lies, but in the corporate world, even an accusation like this was damaging. I had to spend the next 2 weeks proving my innocence. At night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering how my own family could do this to me. They had always manipulated me, always taken advantage of me. But now, they were trying to destroy me. And for what? Because I wouldn't let them drain me dry? That was the moment I decided I was done. I hired a lawyer. I had initially thought about just cutting them off and walking away. But after what they had done, I couldn't risk it. They had already tried to sabotage my career. What would stop them from going further? The lawyer helped me draft a formal cease and desist letter. It outlined the harassment, the false accusations, and made it clear that if they continued, I would pursue legal action. I sent copies to my parents, Emma, and every single relative who had sent me a hateful message. The fallout was immediate. Emma exploded, calling me every name in the book. My mother left a voicemail sobbing, saying I had destroyed the family. My father, he didn't say anything, just silence. But I knew he was seething. I blocked them all. A week later, my lawyer called me. We have a problem. My heart sank. What now? Your parents have filed a lawsuit. I felt the blood drain from my face. For what? They're claiming you manipulated your grandparents into changing their will. They're arguing that you coerced them, emotionally blackmailed them into disinheriting your parents. It was laughable. It was also terrifying. Because now, this wasn't just a family feud. Now, it was war. I sat in my lawyer's office, staring at the lawsuit documents. Can they actually win this? My lawyer shook his head. It's a weak case. Your grandparents are of sound mind, and the decision was entirely theirs. But that's not the point. They're doing this to scare you, to drain your time, your energy, your money, to make you regret ever standing up to them. I exhaled sharply. Of course, this wasn't about winning. It was about making me suffer. Then we fight, I said. My lawyer nodded. Then we fight. I wasn't just defending myself anymore. I was defending the life I had built, the freedom I had fought for, and I wasn't going to lose. I never thought it would come to this. Sitting in a courtroom, facing my own parents as they tried to take my money through legal loopholes. But here we were. The tension in the room was suffocating. My lawyer, David Carter, sat beside me, flipping through a thick stack of documents. Across from us, my parents and their attorney, Mr. Holloway, looked too confident for my liking. The judge entered, and everyone stood. We are here today to address the civil suit filed by Mr. and Mrs. Carter against their son. The plaintiffs claim financial entitlement, based on familial obligation. Let's begin. I took a deep breath. This was just the start. Your Honor, Holloway began, adjusting his expensive-looking tie. My clients have spent their entire lives raising their son, providing him with shelter, food, and education. Now, he refuses to support his family in their time of need. We are simply asking for fairness. David stood, his voice calm but firm. Your Honor, my client worked tirelessly to pay for his own education. He was not given the financial support promised by his grandparents. His parents, instead, diverted those funds to his sister. This is not about fairness. This is about manipulation. My mother dabbed her eyes with a tissue. We only wanted him to care for his sister. Family helps each other. The judge raised an eyebrow. Miss Carter, are you saying your son is legally obligated to fund his sister's lifestyle? She has 6 children, Your Honor. What kind of uncle turns his back on his family? She cried dramatically. Objection, David said. Emotional manipulation. This is a financial case. The judge nodded. Sustained. Let's keep this about legal arguments. My father leaned forward, his voice steady. We never asked for much, Your Honor. Just a home for Emma and her kids. A small monthly stipend. He makes plenty of money. He wouldn't even notice it missing. I clenched my jaw. They really thought I was just a walking ATM. David cleared his throat. Your Honor, we have evidence that contradicts the plaintiff's statements. Exhibit A. Bank statements showing that over the past decade, Mr. and Mrs. Carter funneled over $200 meant for their son into secret accounts benefiting their daughter. Gasps filled the courtroom. These are falsified. My mother shrieked, but her face had gone pale. David continued. Not only that, but we have evidence of financial misrepresentation. They have borrowed money from multiple family members, always claiming it was for their son's education. In reality, it was being used to pay off debts Emma accumulated through failed marriages and investments. The judge's face hardened. Is this true, Mr. Carter? My father hesitated. We were just trying to keep the family together. By lying? I finally spoke. By stealing from me? From my future? My father didn't answer. Just when I thought it couldn't get worse, the doors to the courtroom opened. My grandparents walked in. Whispers broke out among the spectators. Your Honor, we have additional testimony, David announced. Mr. and Mrs. Carter's parents would like to provide statements. My parents' faces were drained of color. Grandpa took the stand first. We gave money to my son to support both of our grandchildren equally. We were misled. Misled how? The judge asked. We were told the money was going into a fund for both Emma and our grandson, but we later discovered that it was all spent on Emma's lifestyle. Grandma took a deep breath before speaking. When we confronted them, they promised they would make it right. Instead, they doubled down and started asking other family members for money, under false pretenses. The judge turned to my parents. Do you have anything to say about this? My mother folded her arms. They always favored him anyway. This is their way of punishing us. Grandma looked heartbroken. No, dear. We wanted both of you to have a fair chance. But you stole from your own son. Holloway looked flustered. Your Honor, this is a private family matter. Surely, we can settle this outside of court. No, the judge cut him off. This is fraud. She turned to me. Do you wish to countersue for financial damages? I hesitated. The thought of dragging this out even longer made me sick. No, Your Honor. I just want them to leave me alone. The judge sighed. Very well. I rule in favor of the defendant. Mr. and Mrs. Carter have no legal claim to their son's finances. Furthermore, given the financial misconduct, I am ordering an audit into their handling of funds from other family members. My parents looked like they had been hit by a train. My mother's lips trembled. You can't do this to us. You did this to yourselves, I said quietly. The case was over, but the damage remained. My parents left the courtroom without speaking to me. The family was split, but surprisingly, more people supported me than them. Emma, however, stayed quiet throughout the trial. A week later, she reached out. I never knew how bad it was, she admitted over the phone. They made it sound like you were the selfish one. And you believed them? I asked. She sighed. I guess I did. Until I saw how far they were willing to go. I don't expect you to help me, but I do want to fix things between us. I didn't know what to say. Trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight. We'll see, I said finally. She didn't push. That's fair. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of relief. The battle was over, but the scars, those would take time to heal. I expected to feel victorious after the courtroom battle. Instead, I felt drained. The case was closed. My parents had lost. And yet, the weight of everything still sat heavy on my chest. Family wasn't supposed to turn into an enemy, but here we were. A week after the trial, I received a text from my mother. Meet us one last time. We need to talk. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Curiosity, maybe. Or just the hope that they would finally show remorse. I met them at a quiet cafe, away from prying eyes. They were already seated, my mother's face tight with bitterness. My father unreadable. You humiliated us, my mother hissed the moment I sat down. I scoffed. You humiliated yourselves. You lied, stole, and tried to legally force me to bankroll Emma's life. My father sighed. You could have handled this differently. Differently? You tried to sue me. Silence. Fine, my mother said. If you won't help Emma, at least think about your reputation. People are talking about how you turned on your own family. Do you really want that? I leaned in. You think I care what people say? After everything you did? The only thing that matters now is that you have no control over me. My father's face hardened. If you walk away from us now, don't ever expect to be welcomed back. I smiled. That was never going to happen anyway. I left them sitting there, their last attempt at manipulation failing miserably. Emma had been silent since the trial. Then, she reached out again. I need to see you, please. I debated ignoring her, but something in her message felt different. I agreed to meet at a park. She was already there, sitting on a bench, looking tired. I never realized how much they controlled me too, she admitted. I thought they were helping me, but they just made sure I never had to stand on my own. So what now? I asked. I'm fixing my life. I got a job, enrolled in vocational training. I don't expect anything from you, but I do want you to know I'm trying. For the first time, she seemed sincere. Good, I said, but trust isn't automatic. You need to prove it. She nodded. I know. And I will. A month later, my grandparents called me. We need to talk about the future, Grandpa said. I met them at their home, expecting another discussion about the family fallout. Instead, they handed me a document. We're leaving the family estate to you, Grandma said, and establishing trust funds for all the grandchildren, including Emma's kids. But your parents won't see a cent. I stared at them. That's a lot. We trust you, Grandpa said. You fought for what was right. We want you to ensure this family's future stays in good hands. It was overwhelming, but also an honor. For once, I felt truly seen. Months passed. My parents had moved into a small apartment. Their influence over the family shattered. Then, one day, I received an email from my mother. We know you won't forgive us. We just want you to know that we did what we thought was best. Maybe one day, you'll understand. I stared at the screen for a long time, before closing the email without replying. Understanding wasn't the problem. I just no longer cared. Life felt different, freer. I wasn't just the kid who had to fight for scraps anymore. I was in control of my own future. And that was worth everything I had been through. As for my parents, they made their choices, and I had finally made mine. The trial was over, but the aftermath stretched far beyond the courtroom. My parents had lost not just the case, but their credibility, their free ride, and the support of most of our extended family. The financial audit into their dealings had begun, and early findings weren't looking good for them. More family members were stepping forward, revealing loans never repaid, money taken under false pretenses, and a pattern of manipulation that had gone unchecked for years. But despite their downfall, my parents still refused to accept responsibility. One evening, just a week after the trial, I received a message from my mother. We need to talk, one last time, please. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet her in a public cafe. I didn't want to be alone with her. When I arrived, she was already there, stirring a cup of tea with nervous hands. My father wasn't with her. I just want to understand, she started. Why did you turn on us? We're your parents. I laughed bitterly. Turn on you? You tried to take me to court for money. You stole from me for years. You only ever reached out when you needed something. And now, when everything is falling apart, you want to act like none of it happened? Tears welled up in her eyes, but they didn't move me. You don't know what it's like to be a parent. Everything we did was for our family, for survival. No, everything you did was for Emma. And when the money ran dry, you saw me as your next target. She went quiet, fingers gripping the edge of the table. Your father and I, we might lose everything. The house, our savings, even our friends have turned on us. That's not my problem. Her eyes hardened. So you're really going to let us suffer? After everything? I leaned forward, my voice low. Yes. Just like you let me suffer all those years, wondering why I wasn't good enough. Just like you let me struggle while you handed Emma everything on a silver platter. You made your choices, and now you have to live with them. She didn't say another word. She just stared at me, her expression a mix of shock and anger. Maybe she had truly believed I would cave, that I would be guilt-tripped into saving them, just like they had done to me my entire life. But I wouldn't. Not anymore. I stood up. This is the last time we speak. Don't contact me again. And with that, I walked away. In the following weeks, the financial audit uncovered even more damning evidence. My parents had been taking money not just from family, but from friends, neighbors, anyone who would lend them cash under the promise of repayment that never came. When the audit results became public within the family, the fallout was swift. My grandparents formally cut them off, not just from their inheritance but from any further assistance. My parents lost their home. They were forced to move into a tiny apartment, their lifestyle completely shattered. Emma, to my surprise, didn't rush to defend them. "I can't fix what they did," she admitted to me one evening. "I just want to move forward." For the first time, I believed her. It took time, but I finally started to heal. Without the weight of my parents' manipulation, I began to enjoy life in a way I never had before. I reconnected with family members who had once believed my parents' lies. I traveled. I focused on myself. And then, one day, I received a letter. It was from my father. I hesitated before opening it, expecting more manipulation. But instead, it was brief. "We lost everything. I don't expect forgiveness. Just know that your mother and I finally understand. We were wrong." I stared at the words for a long time, but in the end, I folded the letter and put it away. I didn't respond. Some wounds, no matter how much time passes, don't deserve to be reopened. Because for the first time in my life, I was free.